heard of the quintessential Australian stories and folklore, we've decided to share some of the lesser-known tales. These are the kind of tales that interest us, and if you're interested in the history of Australia, the more obscure stories about places and people you may not have heard of, then stay tuned and enjoy this new series, Aussie Tales That You Weren't Taught. In this episode, we take a look at the School of Bones. Yes, dead bodies have been found in the field of a prestigious Hobart boys' school, the Hutchins School. Now, does that mean a serial killer is on the loose? Well, not now, but very well could have been 200 years ago. Yes, these bodies are believed to be within an old graveyard established in Hobart's early days, which, if you watch our Van Diemen's Demons episodes, was around 200 years ago. Tasmania was discovered before the mainland of Australia. Funnily enough, it was also set up as a convict town way before Melbourne was. You could say Tasmania has settled down a bit since the early settlement. Being away from the mainland, it has not seen the high volumes of people and multiculturalism as much as Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. But back to this magnificent and yet extremely sad finding. It is believed 2,000 bodies have been uncovered through archaeological digging under the school oval, said to be the largest mass exhumation in Australian history. Principal Rob McEwen told the ABC they were planning a large redevelopment of the old hockey field. It was quite an exciting time for the school. He stated he was looking out the window of his room as the excavators were starting on the top right of the field, when everything ceased, and he was promptly advised by the Chief Operating Officer that the excavation team had disturbed human remains. Well, you could imagine how surprised the principal would have been. The school was only established in the 1960s and in use every school day. How could a body be buried without someone noticing ground disturbance? What the principal was to learn over the next 9 months would baffle anyone. It was no secret, though, for the town that the boys' school had in fact been built over an old cemetery, but that was sorted out more than 60 years ago. Hadn't the bodies all been moved to a new location? The answer is yes, and they were meant to be transferred to Cornelian Bay Cemetery, only about 10 minutes drive away. So what happened? But we'll get a little bit of background about the Queensborough Regional Cemetery in question. Now, this cemetery was established in 1873 by 2 local businessmen. By 1913, the Queensborough Cemetery Company had run out of money to maintain the cemetery, and the entire site lay derelict until the Hobart City Council purchased the site in 1915. And later, began building sports grounds. The remainder of the cemetery was used until it was closed in 1934 and was later dismantled in 1961 for the construction of the Hutchins School and associated sports grounds. But what of the bodies? Over those 6 decades, it is believed that 9,000 and 13,000 people were buried there. In Peel Street, the headstones of many of the dead had been preserved in a memorial garden. Other headstones from the original Queensborough Cemetery have been removed to a dedicated area at Cornelian Bay. So weren't then the bodies all moved? No, and here's why. In 1964, the old cemetery site was taken over by the Hutchins School as part of a sale and land swap deal, which stipulated council would fund the exhumation of up to 1,900 human remains. Up to 1,900? What about the remaining, say, 10,000 other corpses? Oh well, I guess they would remain under the school fields, resting in peace, undisturbed forever. But why was the school then digging or surprised at uncovering the dead? Principal McEwen told the ABC that the current school board and administration believed, perhaps naively, that the area had already been exhumed. Well, how wrong they were, and how long it would take then, in this day and age where we love our history and all the red tape that now exists around colonial sites and the correct handling of deceased Australians. The archaeological team relied on old records, which in many cases were not accurate. Historical archaeologist Brad Williams explained to the ABC it's unclear exactly how many bodies were exhumed in the 1960s. At the State Archives, there were folders full of documents and correspondence, some torn, some handwritten, relating to those exhumations. They're hard to make sense of. There is a plan from 1960 that marks various priority areas for exhumation at the time, but Mr. Williams said it's not a huge help. We're not quite sure how much of that was undertaken, he said. On top of the obvious flaws in the record keeping, the site isn't heritage listed, so no red flags were raised when the school submitted its development application to the council. Now the real kicker, Brad Williams went on to explain that he expected, as per normal cemeteries, for there to be several hundred, possibly even 1,000 bodies that they would uncover. But when he and his team of archaeologists, archaeology students and contractors were to find was much more shocking. There were thousands upon thousands and some plots stacked 6 high. And that's just in the school area alone. So what happens next? Working row by row, a mechanical excavator would scrape back the earth to where the archaeologists could just see a coffin lid, and then they'd take over the work with hand tools. Working over Hobart's cold, dark winter, the archaeologists eventually exhumed almost 2,000 bodies. But they had their work cut out trying to figure out who they all were, and early 20th century grave digging scandals didn't help. The cemetery scandal of 1913. Originally, the Queensborough Regional Cemetery was established in 1873 by 2 Sandy Bay businessmen, George Luckman and Stephen Large. Over 3,000 burials took place there, including many early settlers to the area, merchants of Sandy Bay, well-known Hobart town figures, and one of the earliest naval burials in 1877, until the men ran out of money in 1913 and were unable to afford to maintain the site. But until it was public knowledge, some funny business went on. But it wasn't funny. The public would learn in 1913 how the partners cut corners in the business when there were complaints of terrible odours emitting from the cemetery. It was discovered that the graves were not dug to the 6-foot requirement, but only to 4 foot. Coffins were removed so as family members were able to fit in as they passed away in certain plots. Then the original coffin was put back after the funeral, oftentimes too close to the surface. As the bodies decomposed, the smell would arise to the surface. At the time, gravedigger Mr. Young gave evidence in court. Mr. Young spoke out about the disturbing of graves unnecessarily. He stated that his employer, Mr. George Luckman, who was one of those businessmen opening the cemetery, was almost 80 years old now. and had instructed him to move bodies and place them in other graves within the cemetery, not notifying or getting permission of the chief secretary. Sometimes he had to crush graves below to ensure they fit. Young once had a skull stuck to the end of his shovel. Luckman, who was overlooking, began to quote Yorick's skull from Shakespeare's Hamlet, obviously not the least bit surprised or shocked at what was happening. Mr. Young continues, telling the court that one grave in particular Mr. Luckman asked him to dig up was a grave that had 2 small coffins at the top. Mr. Luckman asked him to remove those 2 small coffins so as that they could fit another on top. When Mr. Young challenged Mr. Luckman on why he would just dispose of these 2 coffins, Mr. Luckman simply said they were empty coffins or just boards. Mr. Young and his wife, who was also the bookkeeper for Mr. Luckman, says she assisted her husband in moving the bodies to a general rubbish pile that had always been there. The rubbish pile was then set on fire, as it had normally been at times, to remove rubbish. After this trial, however, human remains would be found on that rubbish pile by police. Mr. Young admitted that these practices did not sit well with him, and he had left the job due to this, but ended up having to go back for financial reasons. Mr. Luckman ended up being fined, and that was the year the business went under, the cemetery being left untouched, until the Hobart Council had to remove the 1900 bodies so as the school could be built. Evidence of George Luckman's questionable burial practices emerged as the excavation teams worked on. They discovered burnt coffins and others that had been compressed. This has made identifying people much harder because we knew he did move people, and there's no documentation of that, spoke Leah Ralph of the archaeologist team. It's like a giant puzzle. While the Hutchinson schoolboys attended class and played tennis nearby, Lauren Hanson-Viney was in the mud struggling to determine who was in each grave. She said, "The coffins are all very decomposed. The wood has rotted away. Only 3% still had visible nameplates." Now, after 9 months of meticulous work, the archaeologists have identified more than 1,700 people and released a public list of their names, a moment of immense satisfaction for the team that were working on the project. It feels like giving back their identity and their history, and it's bringing them back into the world where they've just been forgotten under an oval for so many years, Lauren said. The mass exhumation generates a lot of public interest, some checking to see if their ancestors had surfaced. Some had, but many still remained outside the school zone they were concentrating on, being the oval. One resident, Mr. Hanley, commented, "I know roughly where an ancestor's plot is, and it's probably right on the border. Between the archaeologist's work and the tennis courts." Mr. Hanley hopes that if the tennis courts are ever developed, a future exhumation might uncover his family. Now, the future of the remaining bodies under the school. As part of the 1960s land deal, Hutchins School was required to bear all costs associated with future exhumations. Principal McEwen mentioned that the bill was approaching $1 million so far, that the school was pleased with the tremendous learning from the process. He said, "Certainly, we move forward far more knowledgeable about the site, its history, and need to be sensitive to any development that might take place. This is because the archaeologists have only exhumed about 15% of the original cemetery's footprint, meaning there are still hundreds maybe thousands, of bodies beneath the school property. It's not uncommon for schools, public institutions and even privately owned properties to be built on top of the cemeteries, Mr. Brad Williams of the excavation team noted. Off the top of my head, I can think of probably another half a dozen smaller cemeteries around Hobart that have been later developed, and that's not unique to Hobart. Well, we know both Town Hall and Central Stations in Sydney were built over early cemeteries, and work has been done there too. But how many more bodies are buried under schools, shops and homes around Australia? Could you be living on an ancient burial ground? The bodies from the Hutchins School that have been exhumed are now being located at Cornelian Bay Cemetery, not too far from the original spot. There is also a memorial that has been created close to the Hutchins School, the Queensborough Memorial Reserve, where some of the headstones have been preserved. If you're in that area, it'd be nice to have a look. I know I'll be making a visit there next time I'm in Tasmania. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to give us a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell so you're aware when we have another story about an Aussie tale you haven't been taught.